Lawyers, what is the sneakiest clause you've ever found in a contract? No lawyer, but in grad school, I was desperate to find a cheap apartment. Since this was pre Craigslist, I got a post from a literal bulletin board at the school. Met up with the girl who had the room, seemed fine, seemed okay with me, so I signed papers for the place. Then I moved in. Once I moved in, she had all these extra rules for me put my TV downstairs in the basement, use the bathroom down there, etc. I was sick one day and used the upstairs bathroom directly next to my bedroom and she started yelling at me, yada, 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 yada. I needed to leave. I looked at the lease I signed and it said, this contract is null and void if rent is not paid by the 7th of the month. So I just moved out. I left a note letting her know what was up and she called me screaming, that was for my protection, not yours. Story 2. Not a lawyer here, but a few years ago I was working for a small company. We occupied the entire first floor of a small building. And one Monday morning, we got to the office and half the floor was flooded with water because the landlord workers were moving some stuff over the weekend and they broke a water sprinkler and left it that way overnight. Lots of water damage, and we relocated the people in the flooded area into the other half of the floor that was okay. We remained like that for about 6 weeks. When it was time to pay the rent, the lease contract was written in a way that we owed rent money in its entirety, even if the facilities were not available, no matter what the reason was. We went back and forth and we had to pay, and the landlord was a real bum about it. Then I had what I consider a brilliant idea. When we filed for our insurance claim, we included that rent money in the damages, half of the rent for the 6 weeks. Our insurance paid us, no problem. It just so happened by pure chance that our insurance carried happened to be also the insurance carrier for the landlord, and they were not too happy about the incompetence of the landlord, the lack of responsiveness, and the way the lease contracts were written. So within a few days from us receiving the check, we got a lot of phone calls from the insurance people asking about the building and the landlord. And then 3 people from the insurance company came to pay a visit to the building too. I guess they raised the landlord's insurance rate by quite a bit. He was absolutely angry and demanded to see the paperwork of what we filed as claims, what we told the insurance, etc., and said that he would have to increase the rent because of his insurance costs had gone through the roof. We told him to go screw himself and moved out 3 years later at the end of the lease. Story 3. My company was switching to a different payroll provider and they had 3 pages of items like, we are not responsible for the safety of your employees' private information, including social security numbers and banking info. When we asked them about it, they played dumb, they got really aggressive, then finally told us they didn't want to be sued if they got hacked or had a disgruntled employee take payroll information with them when they left. Needless to say, we did not sign with them. Story 4. This might be the opposite. I had a lawyer friend who leased a car from a dealer that had a really poorly written contract. Depending on how a car lease is written and maybe depending on what state you're in, the dealer either continues to hold title to the car while it's leased to you, with the contract giving you right of possession, or you hold title to the car while the dealership has a lien on the title so that ownership returns to the dealer at the end of the lease. This contract gave the dealer the lien rather than the title, but the way it was written, the entire contract expired at the end of the lease term, including the provision that returned the title to the dealer. So essentially, the contract disappears, my friend is left with both the car and the title to the car, the dealer has no legal rights to the car. The dealership called her up and asked when she would be returning the car. She said, I'm not. They said, oh, you're buying the car then? She says, no, I'm just going to keep it, thanks. The dealer sued her, then realized they messed up the contract and offered to settle. Since she wasn't completely confident that a judge would just find a way to justify giving the car back to the dealer, since this was pretty unfair after all, she settled, but the settlement ended up being her buying the car for like 20% of its value. Story 5. I once worked with a lawyer who wrote up his own NDA, non-disclosure agreement. These are usually a page or 2 and have very common things in them. This piece was nearly 10 pages, so I went through it very carefully. He had things in there like I agreed not to work with anyone I talked to while consulting for him, whether on his business or not, and that he had a complete license to anything I made or conceived of, even if I didn't write it down during the time I was consulting for him. Needless to say, I redlined the thing heavily and gave it back to him along with a standard NDA that I typically used. We ended up signing that one. Story 6. I work for a group of professionals. There was a falling out over pay and time off. I agreed to stay if certain conditions were met. They insisted on a contract for my next year's work. I had already corrupted their corporate attorney. We drew up the contract together. When his secretary typed it up, he read through it and then told me that the contract obligated the corporation to pay my wages, pension, medical, dental, and other benefits for the full year, but didn't obligate me to do anything in return. We put in a stipulation that it was payment for prior unpaid work. I knew none of the overeducated fools would read it, and they didn't. They just signed it. Out of the pure goodness of my heart, I believe that I actually worked 14 weeks in the next year. Story 7. Ironically, it was in one of my own. At the time, I was in law school, and my SO and I were living in an apartment. The apartment was okay, but it had really crappy plumbing, which was connected between apartments. We were the top apartment. Anyways, one day the plumbing burst in the apartment below us. The complex said that we had been putting pasta down our drains, and there was a clause in our lease which stated that they could fine us for damaging the plumbing by putting pasta down the drains. Not grease, not hard objects, pasta. Luckily, I got us out of it, but it was incredibly ridiculous that I had to argue with him about it. Story 8. I reviewed a business sale contract once for the sale of a convenience store. The attorney who drafted it added a provision that he be allowed a six-pack of beer of his choosing for free every time he visited the store. When I pointed it out to the client and confronted the other side, it was communicated to them that their lawyer added that to see if anyone was actually reading it. It was funny, but I thought it was exceedingly unprofessional. Story 9. I'm an attorney and I work for a large university. A few years ago, the university bid a near exclusive dining services contract that applied to every part of campus except the libraries. Company A won the campus wide bid. When the libraries bid their dining services, Company B, Company A's main competitor, won the bid. Company B's contract had several exhibits. One of the exhibits was a technical exhibit, for example, how many ovens they would have, number of employees, etc. And in the middle of the last page, the technical exhibit, in about 6-point font, it read, University hereby terminates its contract with Company A and hereby appoints Company B as the exclusive provider for all dining services. We caught it and deleted it. Well, I guess someone at Company B clearly played way too much Assassin's Creed and thought contract law worked like a hidden blade attack. Story 10. I'm a law student, not a lawyer, but my contract law teacher told us about a few cases she had encountered, mainly one where a company tried to add a clause in very pale gray on a contract, hoping that the other party wouldn't notice or would assume it was a break or that it had been invalidated. Also, in a case in particular, a placement agency had a clause in the contract they signed with their clients saying that the client would not be employed elsewhere, otherwise they would be forced to pay a $200 fee. However, the guaranteed number of hours was not respected, and the employees couldn't make a living with the offered hours and pay, so many took a second job and were subsequently sued by the agency. Thankfully, the judge ruled in favor of the employees, but I felt this could relate to the question pretty well. It was a penal clause, which basically means excessive liquidated damages and isn't validated in common law. However, it is in civil law, but the prejudice must be proven, not the opposite way around, which is good for the smaller party, which needs to be protected. The exclusivity clause was invalidated 1437 CCQ because it was a misused clause, and when the principal falls, the accessory falls, which means that the penal clause was also invalidated, thankfully. Story 11. Not necessarily a sneaky clause, just a sneaky use of it. I worked for many years for federal government departments. These departments, particularly the higher levels of them, would often hire expensive consultants for various reasons or projects. After all, what the hell? It was only taxpayer money, and it was useful to hire expensive consultants so that when something all fell apart years later, those responsible could say, it's not our fault, we hired a really expensive consultant. Anyway, in order to cut down on excessive hemorrhaging of money, a rule had been put in a long time ago that if a consultant was engaged for a short time, they would be paid hourly fees, which were pretty wallet gouging. But if they continued to be engaged by the department for more than a certain period, 6 weeks, I think, they were to be switched to a much less expensive longer-term contract, essentially swapping higher rates for a more stable income source. One specialist consultant we heard about was brought in and, to justify his rather high hourly rates, somewhere north of $400, was assigned to assist multiple important bosses in multiple areas, so theoretically, he'd never be idle on the government dollar. So far, so standard. Except when the time came around for him to be switched to the long-term contract, all the bosses of his who would have signed off on the change assume it had already been done by one of the other bosses and didn't really want to chase up personally because, hey, it wasn't coming out of their budget. And it was additional work which, if ignored long enough, someone else might do. Also, if any one of them did do it themselves, it'll be admitting that they had more free time than their contemporaries, and their own bosses would find more work to take up that free time, whether it existed or not. So no one signed the changeover, and the consultant very conscientiously came in early, signed out late, submitted his timesheets, and kept being paid at the hourly rate for over a year. When an audit finally spotted what had happened, they tried to sue him to reclaim part of the $1,000,000+ they'd paid him over that time. Unfortunately for them, the contract was pretty much airtight, and nowhere in it did it mention that it was for a maximum time only, or that after 6 weeks he should be switched to the lower rate. That was merely a departmental policy, not law. Of course, they canned his existing contract ASAP and didn't invite him back, but somehow I don't think he was too worried. Story 12. Mark Zuckerberg was an equal stake founder of Facebook in its younger days with Eduardo Saverin, 60-40, something like that. Eduardo got sneaky and dropped his responsibilities almost completely and started sneaking ads for his new startup, J something, can't remember, into Facebook without Mark's permission, which he was developing behind Mark's back while he was supposed to be working on Facebook. If you remember the older days of the internet, ads were extremely unpopular and could easily drive away the hard earned user base of the tiny startup. Mark was livid as Eduardo had been slacking off and giving excuses for a long time coming. Now, this. After discussion with his angel investor Peter Thiel, they sneaked a clause into a new contract which was only supposed to readjust equity, very common when seeking investor funds, giving Mark the ability to vote by proxy on Eduardo's shares on all material matters as per company law. Mark then set up a new company in a different state to acquire the original company, use Eduardo's proxy votes in the old company to approve the merger, then gave Eduardo a 0.02% stake in the new company. Nobody else's equity stake was changed. Eduardo's stake was given to a new investor, the one Mark flipped off in the movie, effectively kicking only Eduardo out from Facebook. After the events of the movie, Eduardo's stake was restored to 7% from his original 22% before the shenanigans. He's now worth north of $4 billion, which could have been 20 plus billion if all this hadn't happened. If you've watched The Social Network, you've seen the proceedings. Story 13. I had to sign a non-compete/non-disclosure when I worked for a small tech firm, pretty standard. I did some travel at the company expense, and when I quit, the owner came after me stating that I owed him for this because it was in my contract that I had to pay back any expenses for 2 years prior to my separation. I'd never seen this on the contract, and he didn't know that as I was filling out my paperwork for the job, I had initialized each page and asked the secretary to make me a copy. He had added 4 pages to the contract and forged my signature. Turns out he had did this for all of the others as well. He had his attorney file a case against me and 2 others that had left when I did. Luckily, one of them also had a copy of his original contract, and we were able to get him investigated for fraud and forgery. His fiancée was the daughter of his lawyer. I knew he was also one of the women that worked in the AP department. One phone call to his fiancée, she showed up and caught them in his van, and her daddy broke off all legal services. The case fell apart, and he got 2 years in a state prison. Story 14. After reading some answers here, I'm really curious about contracts in general in America. I live in Brazil, by the way. Don't you have laws against absurd clauses in contracts? Here in Brazil, if someone puts absurd clauses in a contract, like some that I read here, you have to keep the cats if you buy the house cannot be sold to a colored person, we are not responsible for the safety of your employees, private information, etc., the contract is considered void and null. It doesn't matter if you sign the contract, you don't have to obey any strange clause. Also, if a contract here in Brazil is written with the text formatting, size 10-point, color black, for example, but there is a clause with a format size 6-point, color light gray, that clause is considered void and null because the contract is trying to deceive the person that is signing it. Story 15. I'm a lawyer. It is my habit that when somebody in any retail business hands me a form requiring my signature, I return it to them unsigned. If they notice and ask, then I don't put up a fight, but this practice has helped me immensely in the past. Most recently, it helped when I tried to ship a golf club to a friend who had left it at my house. I get it boxed up, go to UPS, and get the person to ship it. They handed me a form to fill out with the standard "we aren't responsible for your crap" clause, and I didn't sign it. The clerk didn't notice. When it showed up at my friend's house in 2 pieces, seriously, what the heck did they do? Fold it in half? I called UPS to complain. They said, "But you signed a contract, blah, 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 blah," to which I replied, "Good luck finding one with my signature on it." In the end, I was able to negotiate $400 out of them since replacing 1 iron in a set of golf clubs is pretty tough to do. I have no ethical qualms about this. They are depending on the consumer either not understanding or not noticing the important clauses in their contracts, so I feel it is pretty fair when I depend on their employees to do the same. Story 16. Not quite the same, but relevant. I used to write up minutes for a meeting that was held every month. No one ever read the minutes, despite one of the first orders of business being that everyone voted to agree to them as a true record. After one meeting, I slipped into the minutes. The chair agreed to buy everyone drinks all night at pub after the next meeting. No one noticed. All agreed with them. Drinks were duly had. Everyone took much better care after that. Story 17. Barely applicable to your question, but in the vein of other responses, so here goes. My sister-in-law took a job with a major hardware store chain. Shortly after being hired, they had her sign a credit card application for an American Express card. She did not think much of it at the time. She was young and not very financially savvy and soon forgot about it altogether. 3 years later, they laid her off. A couple of months after that, they sent her a notice demanding she relinquish her rights to her Amex members' reward points, over 1.5 million of them. You see, they had, illegally, we came to learn, been using her credit card to pay for travel expenses for the company's salespersons. 3 years of travel, airfare, hotels, car rentals, etc. All the while, the card was racking up members' rewards points. Her and my brother hired a lawyer, and they were able to keep all of the points through a negotiated settlement. The company had no legal claim to the points, and if the issue went to court, they faced potential liability and a countersuit for unlawfully using her credit card for company expenses. While she had signed the card application, she never formally authorized them to use her credit. They lived pretty high on the hog for a few years. They were able to go to Hawaii virtually expense free twice. Plus, they flew out to see myself and other family members for the weekend whenever they felt like it. The best part for her, though, was the revenge factor. She really liked her job and was angry about getting laid off. Story 18. While not necessarily sneaky, I find the concept of the poison pill to be nefarious. A poison pill is essentially a provision in some corporate documents which triggers when a person attempts to purchase a significant portion of the company from the shareholders, usually with pretty nasty effects to the purchaser. For example, a poison pill may trigger when a single person attempts to purchase 20% of a corporation. The poison pill may give all the shareholders except the prospective purchaser a chance to buy tons of shares at a minimal price and have the corporation pay for that expense. This would mean that the purchaser who just purchased a 20% share of the corporation would have much less of the corporation. Poison pills have been upheld in court, but they are controversial because they enable corporate boards to entrench themselves in the company and effectively restrict shareholders from being able to sell their shares in many instances. Story 19. My matrimonial lawyer gave me a retainer agreement which states that she'll charge $250 an hour. Fees are usually based on the hourly rate. However, in certain circumstances, the fees can be more. For example, if she has to set aside other work, or if she has to work on an expedited basis, blah, 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 until we get to my personal favorite, higher fees if she gets me an exceptionally good result. So, who's going to decide what's an exceptionally good result? Yeah, and I'm sure she'll reduce her hourly rate if she gets an exceptionally crappy result. This is why people hate lawyers, because they're parasites. $1,000 for a desk-ordered divorce? That's 45 minutes of secretarial work. Story 20. I deal with wage hour law, so I deal with anything to do with wages, employment law. I have had employers try to pay an employee $8 per hour, the minimum wage in California, and escort the employee to the check cashing firm only to turn over 60% of their wages as a condition of employment in cash back to the employer. It happens all the time. Redditors would be surprised if they realized how much they could potentially be screwed over in the job sector. Remember, an employer's job is to make a profit, not employ employees. And if you're enjoying the video and learning a thing or two from these stories so far, there's a bunch more good stuff to learn. Don't forget to hit that subscribe and like button for more videos just like this. On to the next one. Story 21. Conveyancing firm in the UK, dealing with a complete schmuck on the other side who kept saying they were waiting on documents from us to their client when it was actually us waiting for them to respond. Went on and on like this, and they took weeks to respond to basic inquiries. We ended up putting a clause in the exchange on contracts, basically an agreement to purchase, deposit goes across, and if you back out afterwards, you lose deposit and breach contract, and didn't use standard conditions and had a clause that said the purchaser's conveyancers were to pay for professional window cleaning once a month for 2 years. It would have been arguable in court if it was valid, as the client signed the contract and the firm wouldn't be held for the client promising it, obviously, but with a stroke of luck, the firm signed on the client's behalf, which you can do on exchange, not completion. A month after it was all concluded and parties had both moved house, we sent them a letter asking for the contract to be upheld. Never heard anything back whatsoever for over 6 weeks. Then they agreed a date for it to be done and argued it was a gesture of goodwill and it wouldn't be valid, etc., and a few hilarious phone calls pointing out they signed it and had a duty to explain it fully to the client prior to signing it, so they couldn't argue they had no idea. The firm I worked for went into voluntary liquidation soon after, and we were not able to keep it up. We let our client know, though. I believe it ended up getting sorted and he was getting his windows cleaned for 6 other times. Conveyancing is boring 99% of the time. That one was 1% was fun. Story 22. A little late to the thread, but there was a story in the local paper about the lowest rent in the city. 2 people were only paying the equivalent of $84 per month to live in a 50 square meter apartment in a fairly attractive part of town. A normal rent would be well over 10 times that amount. $84 per month couldn't buy a parking space in the city. The story was that the owner of the apartment complex wanted to sell the apartment back in 1977, but the rules were that first he would have to offer the tenants a chance to buy the apartments in some sort of housing equity partnership. So in order to discourage them from doing that, he offered them a contract which stated that the rent could never increase. 2 brothers still live in one of the apartments to this day and refuse to move out even after being offered the equivalent of $100,000 each to move out. The owner took them to court, but the court upheld the contract. Wait, only $84 a month? They're practically making money just by living there. I bet their biggest expense is still that daily cup of coffee. Story 23. Not a lawyer, but from the sports world, the poison pill battle between the Minnesota Vikings and Seattle Seahawks in 2005 and 2006 is quite humorous. So, Minnesota wanted to sign a free agent from Seattle. Minnesota offered the player, Steve Hutchinson, a contract that would become automatically guaranteed if he was not the highest paid player at his position on the team he signed with. Seattle had recently offered a slightly larger contract to another player at the same position on their team and had to let Hutchinson go to Minnesota. Seattle turned the tables the next year. They signed a player from Minnesota, named Burleson, with the provision that his entire contract would become automatically guaranteed if he played more than 5 games in Minnesota. Minnesota had to let Burleson go to Seattle. It should also be noted that this back and forth led to the NFL banning poison pill clauses like this. Story 24. Party agrees to supply tea and biscuits to company personnel making site visits for the purpose of carrying out the provisions above. I was one of 2 people working in a small business and had been asked to draw up an operating and maintenance contract that we were to send to a larger company who wanted to hire us to do something. This was something I was utterly unqualified for, and we couldn't afford to have a solicitor to do it, but I made the best shot of it by trying to keep it as simple as possible, what they had to pay us, what we had to do, sort of thing. I stuck the above in as a placeholder for a section as an in joke and forgot to remove it when I mailed it in. When we arrived at the first call out, tea and biscuits were waiting as per agreement. Story 25. Not a lawyer, but here's my story of why it's important to read every little clause and things you sign. Before everything was digital, you would get your coverage papers from the insurance company in a big stack of papers that would normally get thrown out. At the bottom of each page was a number and a dash stating when the page was placed into the packet. Some were much older than others. When I got into a nasty car accident, totaling my car and beating me up pretty good in the process, I thought I was effed. I had no insurance, and as soon as the hospital I was in found out, they took all the braces and crutches away and all, but kicked me out with a substantial bill. Beaten and broken, I began reading my coverage and happened upon a certain clause stating that if I was in an accident and safety bags were deployed and I had my seatbelt on, I could receive a special medical coverage up to quite a large amount. I called the company and spoke with a bunch of people who said that clause was no longer valid. A day later, I got a call from what I'm guessing was a lawyer or someone high up. Apparently, a couple hundred packets had gone out with this clause that had expired 5 years earlier. They said they would send a check, but that they were ending their relationship with me and that I had to sign things to absolve them. Anyways, always read the fine print and always call and ask. Story 26. Kind of relevant, I guess. I went to that Just Fab website where all their shoes are advertised as $40, and they offer your first pair for $20. So I immediately bought a pair of boots. However, I'm pretty good at spotting red flags, so when it asked me to confirm I had read the conditions of becoming a VIP Just Fab member, I actually went and read it. Apparently, every month you have to either buy something from their website or manually select skip this month. If you forget to do either and don't end up making a purchase, your credit card is charged $40 for that month. I'm waiting until my boots arrive and then I'm canceling my account, but if I hadn't read that, I would have likely deleted their emails without a second thought and ended up being charged crazy amounts of money. I feel bad for anyone who has fallen for that. Story 27. When my father got very sick with cancer around 13 years ago, he couldn't keep up with his firm and the bank went after him. Since he was very sick, me and my sister had to step up when we found a really, really good lawyer. The schmucks from the bank had a credit contract that my father signed in the 90s when Portugal still had its own currency. When the lawyer asked for the contract, someone from the bank had written a euro symbol on top of the original currency symbol, the escudo symbol that looks like a dollar sign but with 2 vertical slashes instead of only 1 slash. This was golden for the lawyer and was one of the main reasons that we managed to fight them back. What disgusted me more in this whole process was that we were willing to give the bank what my father owed them. We had some properties that we tried to give to them, very well located and worth more than what we owed them, but they were so greedy that they said the properties weren't worth enough and they wanted all possessions from my family, including the house where we lived. To this day, I still hope that the people in charge of this whole process suffer a lot through their lives as they made us suffer. Story 28. Not actual clauses, but type of clauses. I would have to say the choice of law clause in international contracts can be exceptionally sneaky. Take a sale of potatoes from Chile to the US. The choice of law in the contract says that the contract is governed by US law. You would think that when a dispute arises, the Uniform Commercial Code applies, right? Nope. Depending on what the other party wants, they can pull out the CISG card, UN International Law for Sale of Goods, which trumps all US legislation. So, if a party expects a set resolution according to a chosen national law, they can find themselves well and wholly screwed if the more powerful law has different sets of rules. This applies to other international contracts as well. International laws usually trump national laws, and few lawyers even know about them. So don't sign an international contract without a very good lawyer who knows their crap on the subject. Your mom's friend Bob, who does all the wills and has a nice Kua, box, and Aston, is not going to cut it. Story 29. Not a lawyer, but had to help my parents out with a contract. This company had offered to paint their roof with their super special guaranteed for 20 years paint for around 4 times what it normally costs to paint a roof. In the fine print, it basically said that they were not responsible for the paint peeling off at any point if the roof had been painted before. They then went and used an acrylic paint directly over an oil paint without even brushing off the loose bits, so the paint didn't even stick at all and they basically destroyed the roof. The wording was something like, if there is any substrate on the tiles, we are not responsible for blah 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 blah. The issue here is that it was an iron roof. Once our lawyer pointed that out and informed them that we wouldn't be paying, and if they took us to court, we'd be countersuing for the cost of re-roofing the house. We didn't hear from their goons again after that. Story 30. Not entirely on topic, but one that made me angry as a consumer and I'm going to vent. About 3 years ago, we took a family holiday in the Northern Territories in Australia. There's a company that offers activities up platforms in the forest canopies with the platforms connected by zip wires. Fab, just what the kids would like. So we went along, got paid up, they strapped us all into harnesses into a large group, and then handed over the disclaimer forms. They were 2 pages long. Most of the clauses were perfectly reasonable, covering the fact that the activity was inherently dangerous, setting out about pre-existing medical conditions, etc. And then there were a couple of clauses saying that we could not take them to court even if their active gross negligence caused an incident. I explained that I was unhappy signing such a clause. They explained that their lawyers said it was absolutely fine. I said I wasn't surprised. My 7 and 9-year-old weren't best pleased as we were taken out of our harnesses and left much ice cream to be administered. Story 31. How about the dumbest clause? I had a company that hired me, and just after 3 months, I had to be gone for a few days, and I didn't have much of a choice in the matter. It was crunch time for the company, and they were not happy with me taking off. The boss sat me down and explained his disappointment. Ovid Pearl, this is a very bad timing, and I don't want you to take this the wrong way, but I have to point out that your contract has you on probation for the first 6 months, and we can let you go at will. I replied, actually, no, my contract says that I'm on probation for 3 months, and that gets extended to 6 months, if and only if you extend it in writing, and I agreed to the extension. You never extended it, and hence I never agreed. In fact, if everyone's contract is the same, you have several employees here who are no longer on probation, even though you might think they are. My boss just sat there and stared at me for a moment, then he nodded and said, I'll look into it, thank you. Nothing more was said about the matter. Note to U.S. readers, this was in France, and French labor law strongly protects the workers. You generally cannot be fired without cause. Story 32. Often when dealing with an author, movie companies will create a giant contract that gives the author everything that they want, creative control, choice of actors, and the ability to cancel the creation of the movie if it doesn't stay true to the author's wishes. Then, inside of this giant 1,000-page contract is a smaller contract that will say something to the effect of, disregard everything in this contract but these next 5 pages, and in those 5 pages, the company will put exactly what they want and screw the author in the process. Story 33. I have seen a sneaky contract. In a matter I dealt with a few years ago, I had a celebrity client who was a bit dim. The contract was headed Loan Agreement. It was actually a trust, putting a whole lot of assets in the other parties' beneficial ownership while our client retained legal ownership. When we asked our client if he had the intention to create a trust, a necessary element, he said, yeah. We were a bit confused and said, what is a trust? His answer, what friends have. I have seen a lot of people try and put clauses specifically excluded by law, but a crafty technique I use and that has worked for a client to the tune of $500,000 is overturning a legal default. In the law, the default position is first debt in, first debt paid. So your oldest debt is cleared first unless you put in a clause that says payments are to be applied at the discretion of the insert your client. I always put this in settlement deeds for ongoing matters like leases where people have built up arrears. So we can continue to apply all payments firstly to the new rent, so until they pay off the old debt, we are able to kick them out. Story 34. I was selling my condo, FSBO, and openly disclosed a pending assessment. The snake real estate agent, a realtor even, put in a bid buried in the last pages of the contract that I would pay for any assessments in the next year, even after I specifically said my price was firm and any assessments would be the new owner's responsibility. I turned down the offer. She rewrote another offer where I was to pay the buyer $2,500 for moving expenses, all hidden in the contract. Never trust an unknown real estate agent, ever. I felt bad for a client who was trying to buy her first property and whose price I would have accepted. Ended up selling it to FSBO for cash. Sometimes total honesty does work out. Story 35. Disclaimer, not a lawyer myself, but grew up around them, and as a result, I pay very close attention to how things are written or spoken. I've been a computer systems engineer for the last 20 years. About 2 years ago, the company I worked for got bought by a larger company. The larger company did a lot of government contracting. I ended up causing quite the upheaval when I was told by some of the higher muckmucks in the purchasing company that I would be taking over the servicing of a few of the government contracts. I had expressed my unhappiness with the idea, but was told to just do it. So I sat down and started reading the contracts and writing down all of the technical faults in said contracts. These included me working on servers and databases for a DoD group when I did not have any type of clearance, and a clause in one of the contracts that said we would provide said governmental entity with 5 iMac Pros. Such a computer does not exist and has never existed. After I documented 12 pages of gross errors such as those things and then took them to one of the corporate vice presidents who knew me well, the end result was 1. I was not required to service these customers. 2. The lawyer from the company that bought us, who had written these contracts, suddenly retired. And 3. All of the contracts went to review with both lawyers and engineers reading the contracts over to make sure there were no more disasters on the horizon. Story 36. When I worked for a T-Mobile retailer who changed our payroll over to ADP and used that as justification for new employment contracts, I went through mine and found a clause that stated if I quit or was terminated, I had to surrender my cell phone to the company to be reset to factory settings, erasing all contacts and pictures. They said this was to keep us from capturing proprietary and client information. I quote-unquote forgot to sign mine. When they fired me, my boss asked for my phone. I declined and he told me he would call the police. I explained a contract was never signed, and even if it was signed, this was a civil matter. I told him to sue me if he wanted my personal property, and I left. Story 37. A company I used to work for had the most gloriously sharky corporate lawyer I'd ever met. He would run around the office giddy like a schoolgirl whenever he got a signature on a contract that he had wildly skewed in our favor. I used to refer to him privately as Schadenfreude Esquire. God, he was ruthless. He would get really excited whenever he had the opportunity to choose someone out on the phone, and he would literally be standing at his desk screaming legal jargon peppered with obscenity. If you've seen Suits, picture Louis Litt at his best. One that sticks out was a mutual indemnity clause, which basically says neither party can hold the other responsible for damages. Except there was no reason why we would sue the other company. They weren't bringing any risk with them, and tons of reasons why they would want to sue us because we were taking on quite a bit of risk. Imagine they're a hotel renting a ballroom and we're a convention of chainsaw jugglers. The other lawyer tried to dispute it, and Schadenfreude Esquire kept saying, "But it's mutual indemnity." Another, he spent days negotiating limits for damages in some subsection of a really important partnership deal. After it was signed, he was laughing that all the limits were completely unenforceable because he had slipped in elsewhere that anything resulting in a lawsuit constituted a breach of contract and the section containing the limits was nullified in any breach of contract. All his negotiation was theater to make sure the other guy didn't go back and reread the things he'd already agreed to. And then, in his private life, he was the biggest sweetheart. He had 2 daughters about whom he would get misty just talking about their schoolwork. We're still friends on Facebook, and all his pictures are of them in Disney World and petting ponies and stuff. He looks like a really awesome dad. God help whoever marries that girl. That person will either make his greatest ally or his worst enemy. Story 38. Any contract that contains a mandatory binding arbitration clause, look in the fine print of contracts like cell phone agreements, cable TV service plans, any software terms of service, and you'll probably find a mandatory binding arbitration clause. Mandatory arbitration means that before you take someone to court for breaching the contract, you have to enter into arbitration, which is a quasi-court process where it's not a judge or a jury, but a panel of experts who evaluate the claim and determine who wins. Binding means that whatever that panel of experts decides, you are stuck with it. There's no court of appeals to take up a dispute you may have with the ruling, like in a usual circuit court case. Arbitration has some valid uses, especially in very technical settings where it would take too long to educate a judge or jury about the ins and outs of a complicated medical device patent. More often than not, however, it is used by a richer contracting party to discourage the poorer party from bringing a lawsuit. This is because arbitration has greater upfront costs than starting a lawsuit. For example, the filing fee for a lawsuit with a jury demand for any commercial contract dispute over more than $25,000 in my county is $235. To bring a case before the American Association of Arbitration, The same claim would cost at least $975, an increase in expense the more the amount in dispute. Arbitration also has other features that make it attractive to corporate defendants. First, it's private. If you arbitrate a dispute with your cable company, you can't talk to the news to talk about how they acted and why you're taking them to court. Also, and very controversially in the past month or so, a mandatory arbitration clause can take away potential claimants' opportunities to bring a class action. Class actions are important tools to prevent large entities from doing a small amount of damage to lots of people, each of whom doesn't lose enough to make a lawsuit viable, but who, en masse, are out millions or billions. This is, of course, one individual's view only, and an individual who represents individual plaintiffs, not corporate defendants. AT&T's most likely position on mandatory binding arbitration is that without it, they'd have to expose themselves to cases in courts all over the country, which would make it inefficient to do business. Story 39. I was once reviewing a contract for sale of nickel, the alloy, not the coins, and the buyer would only give me 60% of market value, which I told them was nowhere near enough. So they sent me a new contract for 100% of market value, and I thought, wow, I'll take that. But when I read the whole thing, I found a clause stating that the full market value would only be applied to 60% of the weight of the nickel. Ultimately, I'd get the same payment as 60% value. When I confronted them, they played dumb, swearing it was still full market value. They even went so far as to send me sample calculations that worked out the 60% of the price, but had the 100% market value term bold. And if you learned a thing or two from these stories, here's more for you. YouTube thinks you're going to love this. I'll catch you in that video.